Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We are letting folks in and then we will get started in just a few seconds. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful spring day. So we are here for collaborating across difference. I am Constance McBaron. I'm the Communications and Engagement Lead at Earth Lab, and I will be your moderator for the next hour. We at Earth Lab and at the University of Washington, Seattle recognize that we are on the land where numerous tribal communities have lived since time immemorial. We acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. If you are not joining us from this region, we encourage you to learn about the land you are on at native-land.ca. So we would like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded and it will be made available on our website to reference later. And therefore, in accordance with University of Washington privacy rules, we ask that you keep yourself muted during the event and keep your video off. We do have time available for Q&A at the end, so we do encourage you to ask your questions using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. You can ask your questions at any time and we will try to answer all of them. So our collaborating series was formed to shed light on the difficulties and the opportunities of working together toward a common goal when you come from different backgrounds, different fields, communities, sectors, or geographies. This particular event is the second of a three-part series in partnership with the Washington Sea Grant, who is celebrating 50 years of providing research, outreach, communications, and education to Washington's marine communities. Today, you'll hear from a few of the folks behind the Washington Coast Resilience Project, and I'm really honored to introduce you to them now. First, we have Nicole Faghin. She is the Coastal Management Specialist at the Washington Sea Grant. She is trained as a land use and environmental planner and lawyer. She engages in education, outreach, and research focused on social, economic, and environmental aspects of coastal adaptation and other waterfront issues. In the past 4 years, Nicole managed a portion of Washington's Coastal Resilience Project, working with local governments to enhance their resilience by introducing technical guidance for local planning and project purposes. Nicole holds a master's in city planning from MIT and a law degree from Northeastern University. Harriet is a researcher from the Climate Impacts Group. Harriet Morgan, in close collaboration with state and local agencies, communities, and tribes, evaluates the effects of climate change on natural resources throughout the Pacific Northwest, with a special focus on species and ecosystem vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans. Harriet received a BS in conservation biology from McGill University and an MS in conservation ecology from the University of Michigan. Harriet's professional mission is to help communities increase their resilience to climate change by conducting in-depth quantitative assessments that identify which species and ecosystems are most likely to be vulnerable to the effects of climate change and what adaptation strategies can be implemented to help ameliorate these risks. And last but not least, we have Ian Miller, who is a coastal hazard specialist with the Washington Sea Grant. As Washington Sea Grant's coastal hazard specialist, Dr. Ian Miller works out of Port Angeles and the UW Olympic Natural Resources Center on the Olympic Peninsula, helping coastal communities and public agencies strengthen their ability to plan for and manage coastal hazards, including tsunamis, chronic erosion, coastal flooding, and other hazards associated with climate change. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my slides and I give you Nicole, Harriet, and Ian.
Thank you. You may wonder, what is a big tent having to do with sea level rise? Well, let me tell you. I'm going to tell you stories about big tents and big partners and how we collaborate and are innovative in the work that we've done. And I would like to tell this story with thanks first to Earth Lab and for inviting us to let us share our story. And also thank you, Constance, for all the work you've done in helping us coordinate this and put this together. So the Washington Coastal Resilience Project is really a great big tent story. This is a big tent story about a lot of partners, lots of partners, and we are in debt to all of them for the success of it, really, because each person and each group had a different role in putting this together. And it's from agencies, as you can see, academia, nonprofits, local governments, individuals. And there's pros and cons to this kind of very collaborative approach. But you need everybody to work together to pull it off. And these partners brought in additional in-kind and cash support, and everyone worked together and augmented what was the grant that was the Regional Coastal Resilience Grant that was from NOAA that kicked this all off. So to talk about resilience and coastal resilience, it's really important, first and foremost, to understand this context that we're talking about. So in this case, we're talking about coastal flooding, coastal erosion, landslides, tsunamis, and then all of this exacerbated potentially by sea level rise. So what's the need for this project? Well, let's first start back in 2014 and talk about, at that time, what was going on, which was a lot of scientific and technical information and breakthroughs in climate, and mostly it was focused on mitigation and on greenhouse gas initiatives and et cetera in Washington. But we really weren't seeing much in the way of discussion about adaptive capacity. So we conducted a survey of practitioners and community leaders and said, tell us about first, what are the important topics? And then do you have most of what you might need to address those topics? So the blue lines you see are the topics. What do they think are, whether or not a topic is important? And the choices were shoreline change, sea level rise, spread of invasive species, this whole range of questions about different issues. And then in red, you see the response for each of those is, do you think you have what you need to deal with that? And as you can see, there is a big difference between what people saw as importance and what they needed. So we saw this as this real action gap, this opportunity. And what we focused in on is the issue of sea level rise from all of that, because it seemed that there was a discrepancy that we were finding. It struck us that sea level rise was probably one of the issues we thought people would be the best informed about and have the most information. And we figured that we could fill this gap. It was something that could be addressed so that the resources were not just with the most wealthy or the best resourced or the most progressive communities, that access to information could be available to everyone. And so we wrote this proposal to address this in hopes that the innovations and the information that we produced as part of this project would make it available along with a burst of community engagement and creating momentum so that we're really building this capacity for resilience locally. So it seems like a tall order, but we started with our goal: rapidly increase the capacity to address resilience. And it has 4 steps. Objective 1 is to fill critical information gaps to better communicate. 2, leverage existing policies and programs. 3, learn by doing, and that was working with communities, with pilot communities. And the 4th is use targeted outreach to motivate community action, which seems to be a great linear model that you go from step to step to step. Except what we found was it was very iterative. What happened was it was nonlinear and adaptive, and that each conversation led to the need for going back and having a communication in a different way. So for example, testing out ideas with community, we found we had to go back from what they were saying to then step one of, or the objective one, which is developing the information and to better communicate risks. And from that, then we would try something out and come up with another iteration and working it through. So going through this whole process, that's what this is about. And that's what the story is that we want to tell you today, is how we went through this whole process of building better risk capacity and better resilience through our communities. So let me first introduce Dr. Ian Miller, and then you were going to from Washington Sea Grant, and then we're going to hear from Harriet Morgan from the Climate Impacts Group. Take it away, Ian.
All right, thank you, Nicole, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So I'm Ian Miller again with Washington Sea Grant, and my role in this project was really to help coordinate many of our activities associated with the first objective that Nicole described, which again had that goal of filling information gaps and better communicating risk associated with sea level rise. And again, with a specific focus on supporting coastal managers and planners in Washington State. Go ahead, Nicole. And I'm gonna describe 5 innovations that we incorporated into our approach for developing and communicating improved sea level rise projections. But before I get there, I wanted to start by just emphasizing the role that collaboration, both within and outside the University of Washington, played in making this project a success. And we knew early on that part of the recipe for accomplishing our ultimate goal, which again was focused on developing these technical products that would be used by planners and managers, was by having a large tent of collaborators participating in the development of these technical products, an approach that's really consistent with Earth Lab goals. And our technical team was large and it was multi-institutional. And then we also, and I sort of list out names in that top circle on this slide of most of the key people involved in Objective 1 of the Washington Coastal Resilience Project. But then we also had what I kind of refer to as our secret sauce in the project, which was a whole group of willing collaborators who were really people that have their ear to the ground, are interacting with shoreline homeowners and coastal planners. And we really use them to bounce ideas off of, review language and products, and generally improve our communication and presentation of complex models and ideas. And so I'm listing just some of the names in that second bubble at the bottom of this slide. So our approach was to iterate back and forth between these two groups in a difficult, a process that was not always easy. And in fact, oftentimes it was more difficult than the peer-reviewed publication process, which some of you may be familiar with, but virtuous cycle in the sense that I think what we got out of it was a really nice outcome. And as we did this iteration process, we spun off a variety of reports, papers, and technical products as we went that Nicole described a little bit, and I'm sure you'll hear more about. Next slide, please, Nicole. So let's get to those innovations that we incorporated to help us create a sea level rise assessment that, as we'll show at the end, has helped to close that gap that Nicole discussed in the introduction. First off, we incorporated a probabilistic framework for projecting sea level in Washington State that's designed to better convey the range of uncertainty in future sea level. And this is based on work that was published by Bob Kopp, whose picture is shown here, in 2014. And this framework was selected for a variety of reasons, but partly to address concerns that many of us had encountered actually working with communities and using sort of deterministic scenarios of future sea level that were derived from previous sea level assessments available to us, but that didn't really permit conversations about the likelihood of various possible future sea level scenarios. So this probabilistic framework was really designed to address that problem associated with interpreting uncertainty and the large range of future possibilities that are out there represented in the literature and in other projections. And so what you see here is a representation of Washington State's sea level projections in a probabilistic framework. They sort of have a similar look to sea level projections you might have seen elsewhere, but the key difference is that each of those lines, each of those scenarios has a percentage associated with it, which is an assessment of its likelihood based on what we think we currently know about future sea level. And this kind of enables thinking about sea level projections and uncertainty in more of kind of a cost benefit framework that we find really resonates with coastal planners and decision makers. Next slide, please. The second thing we wanted to incorporate into our project was a detailed and comprehensive analysis of vertical land movement. And that allowed us to create localized or relative sea level projections for every location on the Washington coast. Now, relative sea level projections had been available for Washington State prior to this, but only for limited locations, and their application in other places inevitably led to confusion and distrust. So one of our kind of key goals was to, again, provide a relative sea level projection or localized sea level projection for every location on Washington's coast. And the map on the left here of Washington State with the hot and cool colors is our best estimate of vertical land movement across Washington's coastline. Next slide, please, Nicole. And then another key feature of our work was to try to collate and create a variety of ancillary products and analyses that were meant to inform the various steps involved in setting up and running a sea level rise planning process. And that was meant to address a gap that we'd identified based on our previous experience, in which sea level rise planning processes just required a lot of upfront work to gather all the information you needed from a variety of sources. And so one of our intentions in this project was to create, quote unquote, one-stop shopping for the information that you would need to support a sea level rise planning process. Next slide, please. So that vertical land movement and localizing work that I described in my other slide inevitably led us to designing online and interactive tools that were designed to make it easy for users to access the information most relevant to their communities or place of interest on the coast. That led us to the development initially of the tool that you see here, which was an easily accessible online map that allowed a user to navigate to their place of interest and download their projections as a starting point in their planning process. So promoting accessibility. A user didn't have to go first to the dense PDF we created. They could go straight here and get started on their work if they so choose. Next slide, please. When they clicked on a location, what they got was something like this. And the final innovation I wanted to emphasize is that our initial product, which was a set of sea level projections served as a table or matrix like you see here, designed to allow a user planning group to cross-reference their time frame of interest and their likelihood of a particular future sea level for different uses on the coast that might have different flood tolerances or for different thresholds of importance to a community. And this table was intended to facilitate that. So, the idea of allowing users to make decisions about their time frame and sea level probability of interest using localized projections is a good one. But what we found was that this table, which was what was originally served through that map, didn't work from a communication standpoint. So I present it here as an innovation, but I'm also going to hand it off to Harriet Morgan to describe what emerged from that communication problem we encountered.
Great. Thanks, Ian. And that's a perfect transition point. So I'm going to stay on this slide for a bit and start by talking about three main challenges that we found that our users had with the spreadsheets, which have since been named the dreaded matrices. The first challenge was that they're static, and it was really hard for users to sort of visualize or, imagine the projected change in sea level rise projections through the century. You can see on this table here, if you look at those rows, we have one row for each decadal timestamp out through 2150. And that was really hard for folks to sort of visualize that change through time. The second challenge was that the spreadsheets really didn't facilitate comparison between projections generated under a low and a high greenhouse gas scenario. So you kind of had to align the two spreadsheets on your desktop and toggle back and forth, which was challenging. And finally, the third challenge was that there was no clear takeaway message from the spreadsheets. To get sort of a high level message of what these sea level rise projections meant for your site or the area that you were trying to design for, you really had to spend a lot of time wading through the data to try and figure out what the take-home message was from these spreadsheets. So we took these 3 challenges with the spreadsheet and actually flipped them on their head to kind of use them as goals for what we wanted to achieve with a new sea level rise visualization that we were hoping to build out for this project. So our goals for the sea level rise visualization were that it would allow users to explore the sea level rise projections through time, so out through the 21st century and beyond. They could easily compare sea level rise projections under both a low and a high greenhouse gas scenario, and that the visualization would help provide a clearer take-home message for sort of the takeaway that they should be leaving with after interacting with the visualization. Next slide, please, Nicole. So ultimately what we ended up producing is actually 2 separate visualizations for the Washington State 2018 relative sea level rise projections. Both visualizations enable users to explore how the projections change throughout time. They allow users to interact with all 171 independent sets of sea level rise projections and interact with the greenhouse gas different scenarios there. So this first visualization that you're seeing a screen grab of here enables users to explore projected sea level change by year. So users are exploring different likelihoods for how much sea level rise could occur at different points in time. So a user would use this first visualization to answer a question that's along the lines of this example, which is how likely is it that we will see 1 foot of sea level rise by 2050 at this specific location, which you can see is that blue line segment highlighted on that map there. To the left, Nicole, sorry, on the actual map, just showing the line segment. There it is, awesome. And so then let's flip over to visualization 2. So next slide, please. And so this second visualization looks quite similar, but what this is doing here is enabling users to explore the likelihood of sea level change through time. So if you're answering this hypothetical question of when are we expected to see 1.5 feet of sea level rise at this location, we'd be using visualization number 2. So now I'm going to stop showing you screen grabs and actually do a live walkthrough of this visualization that we ended up developing. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so Nicole, can you nod if you can see the climate impacts group screen? Okay, awesome, thanks. So I'm gonna just do a live walkthrough. This is the climate impacts group landing page for visualization. If we scroll down, here's visualization number 1. I'm gonna do a walkthrough just of visualization number 1, just to walk you through some of the different decision points that a user would need to make to sort of interact with projections for their site of interest. So the first step is to zoom in on this map of Washington here and select a location for where you want to explore projections. So if you hover your cursor over the line segments along the coastline, you'll see that different points start to pop up and sort of highlight in darker blue. And so these are independent sets of sea level rise projections. We've built in a variety of different mechanisms to help you locate your site of interest. You can filter by county, or you can filter by water resource inventory area if that's the scale at which you're planning. And we've also just built in a classic search bar. Let me just go down to Olympia, Washington for the sake of an example, and that'll zoom us in there. And then you can see all the line segments in this area. So let's click here. Once you select a line segment, the projections automatically populate on the graph in the data table to the right. So our next step in getting towards exploring these data a bit more is to select our likelihood or probability of exceedance that we're interested in. And that's sort of this segment of the tool over here. So when you're selecting a likelihood, the most important factor to really understand is the level of risk that's associated with it. And the decision of what likelihood or probability of exceedance to select is an institutional decision. You know, there's no right answer here. And it's going to depend on a variety of different political, financial, or logistical factors that are going to be specific to your institution, your agency, and likely to the project that you're currently working on. And with this project, we provided a wide range of different likelihoods to select from. We include low likelihoods, which sort of span the 17% here to the 1% up here. These are low probability events, you know, sea level rise magnitudes that are less likely to be exceeded. And in certain planning situations, specifically risk adverse situations, these are appropriate values to use. And Ian mentioned earlier that one-stop shopping slide for sea level rise. We've built out a suite of documents to help you sort of hone into the appropriate likelihood range that best suits your need. And Nicole is going to highlight some of those products a bit more. And we also provide high likelihood probabilities of exceedance as well. So these are sea level rise magnitudes that are more likely to be exceeded and are suitable for risk tolerant applications. So when I am exploring a site for the first time, I typically like to look at the 83% probability of exceedance, the 50, the 17, and the 1%. So that is our likelihood decision point. Our third step is to select our greenhouse gas scenarios. So the visualization shows relative sea level rise projections under both a high greenhouse gas scenario, which is, we refer to this as RCP 8.5, and a low greenhouse gas scenario, RCP 4.5. You can look at both, or you can toggle them on and off to keep the viz a bit cleaner. I'm just going to look at the high greenhouse gas scenarios here. So they're shown in orange on this right side of the screen. And then our final decision point before we can dive into the data is over here on the right side of your screen. So this is an optional feature that allows you to select the end year of the projections that we're looking at. So as was mentioned earlier, the projections go out to the year 2150. However, if you want to sort of condense the timeline of that graph that we're seeing here a bit, you can toggle this over. Let's take it into 2100. And you can see that the x-axis on our graph here is reflecting the change we made. If you're interested in earlier projections, you don't have to necessarily modify the end year. You can still pull data from different decades using the hover feature. So those are pretty much all the decision points that you need to make before really diving into the visualization. You can see the data is presented in primarily two distinct ways. On the top half of the visualization here, we have this line graph showing the relative sea level rise projections through time for this specific location that we've selected down here in Thurston County. On our y-axis, we're looking at feet of relative sea level rise change. And on our x-axis, we're looking at time. Because we've selected 2100 here, we're looking at decadal timestamps through the end of the 21st century. And each of our lines on this graph here represent one of the four different likelihoods that we've selected. So we have one curve for each likelihood box that we've checked on the left side of our screen here. So we can see the lightest colors correspond to low probability of exceedances or low likelihoods, and darker oranges correspond to higher likelihoods. And the data table that we have down here on the bottom of the screen is showing the exact same data that's shown in the line graph. It's just showing in a table format. And the last thing I want to highlight about this visualization is my favorite feature, which is one of the communication goals that we were really hoping to achieve here, which is if you hover your cursor over any of these data points, you get this tooltip that pops up. And what this does is it provides the user with a summary statement of what this data point is actually articulating. So I'll read an example here. So for this data point that my cursor is hovering over, it says under the high greenhouse gas scenario, there is a 17% chance that the amount of relative sea level rise will meet or exceed 1.6 feet by 2060 at this location. And so this tooltip is kind of operating in a Mad Lib style fashion where the values will change depending on what point you are looking at, you know, what likelihood curve you're on, what decade you are looking at, what greenhouse gas scenario you're looking at if we'd selected multiple of those. And you also notice that the corresponding cell in the data table below is also highlighting. So it allows users to sort of see where they are in the data. And you can also do it in reverse. So if you prefer to look at the data table, you can hover over cells within the data table and it'll show you the corresponding point there on the graph above. So that was a whirlwind tour through visualization number one. Visualization number two, I'm not going to get into in great detail. It's largely very similar to what I just talked through. The primary difference here is rather than selecting likelihoods over here on the left, we actually provide users with the opportunity to select magnitudes of sea level rise instead. So this is sort of getting at the question of when am I likely to see 1 foot, 2.5 feet of sea level rise at my site? So slightly slicing the data in a slightly different way. So I'll stop my share there. And Nicole, if you wouldn't mind just pulling up the slides again. And then if you could go to the next slide, please. Awesome. So this is, I'll end with this brief summary slide of kind of like what it took to get here. And like Ian said, this visualization wasn't in the original scope or budget of what we decided to scope out with the Washington Coastal Resilience Project, but it arose as sort of kind of more of an organic need, or rather like dissatisfaction with the initial method of results communication. And so what this did was this work leveraged funds from an existing partnership the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group had with Tableau software. And a lot of work went into this tool. We also partnered with a grad student, Paige Lavin from Oceanography, who helped us build it out and dedicated a lot of time. And Tableau also dedicated a lot of time to making this happen. So just wanted to recognize some of the different effort that went in there, and also how this project was able to be quite nimble in adapting to the needs of the end users to ensure that what we were providing at the end of the day was climate information that was going to be useful to and actually used by the decision-making community. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nicole Faghin, who's going to talk about some of our community engagement work.
So all of the work that we're talking about so far is being done for the purposes of engaging with the community. And as we talked about at the very beginning, this not a hierarchy, but these steps that we thought we were taking is this engagement. So really, what does it take to engage the community with something like this? So first of all, we decided who would be our communities that we were going to engage in. And we selected 2 for the purposes of pilot, Tacoma and Island County. And the reason for each of these is Tacoma, a fairly large urban community with a port, industrial area. And by contrast, Island County, which is Whidbey and Camino, much more of a rural-based community and a real focus on issues of residents, single family residents. And so how would sea level rise be affecting each of these different communities, and what were the issues that they were facing? And that was really important. The very first thing we did with both of the pilot communities is sit down with them and say, tell us, what is it you want to gain from this effort, from this resilience effort? What are the problems that we can start to try to address? So this is some of examples of what we heard and then what we came up with. One of the very early ones was with Owen Beach and park improvement in Tacoma. And they had already started in on efforts to design the reconstruction of this beach because it was suffering from erosion and waves and storm damage and flooding in the parking area, et cetera. So when we came and started working with them, one of the things is we gave them some early projections of sea level rise. And you can see here that this yellow line showing some of the potential upper limits of where they may be having some sea level rise impacts in the future. They started saying, maybe the design we have is not the right design. So they went back to the drawing board and redesigned the entire project so that they could be taking into consideration some of these impacts. As you see, right where the red arrow is, that's the parking area. So they realized that they needed to move that up and to change where the parking was. Another example is this is a linear waterfront park along Tacoma. This is Ruston Way. And the park was just starting a visioning process. And the city said, Metro Park said, as part of that, we want to consider sea level rise because whatever we propose as designs for the future may not survive if we have sea level rise impacts. So what can we be doing? So we worked with them. And in this case, this was the use of not only sea level rise, but also using the sea level rise projections, adding to that wave and storm impacts to try to get an idea of what the magnitude of impacts would be on different parts of that waterfront. So as they were going through a visioning process, they could actually start designing and proposing options and alternatives that were going to last much longer into the future in ways that they hadn't really considered before in any of the prior planning processes that they'd gone through. A third issue in Tacoma was the concern about infrastructure planning for their port and industrial area in the tide flats. So they said, we need to consider what we're going to be doing, what the sea level rise impacts are going to be. What do we think about? How do we compare sea level rise projections? So using sea level rise inundation information that we developed as part of this process, it's now being used 2 years later in the tide flats sub-area planning process. So it's one of the important baseline understandings for how they can be building out this area, considering what the future is going to be. And it's just part of creating your baseline information, is having sea level rise information available to start doing that in a sub-area planning process. With Island County, departmental guidance was very important. They were really interested in focusing on how they could develop tools that would help government communicate with the public about sea level rise with specific aspects addressing restoration and for example, considering how to address sea level rise in their shoreline master program. So last year, Island County worked with a few graduate students from the University of Washington planning program to develop what we call a sea level rise strategy study. And this study has a couple of different components, including a community-based resilience study effort, and with all the fact sheets and worksheets, et cetera, so that a community on its own, a neighborhood on its own, could determine what its vulnerabilities are, how it can potentially address those vulnerabilities, what are some of their options that they can be looking at, and starting to think towards the future. And then in the case of both Tacoma and Island County, one thing we heard from them both at the very beginning is that there were restoration projects that they had underway, and they had concerns about how to plan for the projects, how to design the projects, how to maintain the projects that they already had in light of sea level rise. And so this then also led to an effort with a third partner, which was the Estuary and Salmon Recovery Program, ESRP, with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And with this, to examine ways where you can address sea level rise in this planning, designing, and maintaining aspects of projects that are for restoration purposes. And with that, we developed the sea level rise considerations for nearshore restoration that can be used in any community, trying to take on and address those factors and those issues that a community would be needing to think about, whether it's designing or whether it already has a restoration project and wants to maintain it into the future. So the most important aspect of all of this and all of the work that we did is really to make it widely available. And so to do that, we started with the existing Coastal Hazards Resilience Network website, and we added a whole new tab that's for sea level rise. And so this is the Coastal Hazard Resilience Network is available to everybody. It's widely used, widely accessible resources. And it's creating a network of practitioners and agencies, academics, and community members. And the effort has been coordinated through Washington Sea Grant along with Department of Ecology. So we use this as an opportunity to revamp it, the website, and then also to focusing on the multiple audiences that sea level rise will need to be looking at information, different groups who need information, what kind of information, how they access information, and what we had created. And so how can we have that out there to create this collaboration and ability to apply the information in lots of different contexts and for different purposes, and then creating all these resources. How do you make them available? So you want to focus it all in one place. So you can check it out at the wacoastalnetwork.com. is where you can find all of the products that both Ian and Harriet talked about and the things that I was talking about as well. So for example, with respect to the tables that Ian talked about, what do they mean? What's this information in them? We created this document called How to Choose, which is a primer for how you select sea level rise projections off of these tables, and also to help to understand the visualization that Harriet talked about. And then if you don't want to read the document, or in addition to reading the document, we had a webinar, and you can find the piece of the webinar on how to choose and use the numbers by Crystal Raymond from Climate Impacts Group. And that is also on this website. So with that, now I want to turn it over to Ian, who's going to explain how what the outcomes that matter from all of this.
Thank you, Nicole. And this is, by the way, the last slide. And by way of ending, we wanted to take a moment to celebrate the successes of the project. Our goal was to enhance sea level rise planning in Washington State, primarily through making information better and more accessible. And we think that we can demonstrate that we've done that. For example, the red stars on the map on the screen mark local jurisdictions or tribes that we know are using or considering sea level rise in planning or site level decisions or projects using our products. We can also point to a number of statewide or multi-tribal processes or planning tools, facilitated in part by the results of the Washington Coastal Resilience Project, including a new statewide competitive grant program to incentivize planning with sea level rise in Washington's coastal communities, uses in state agency planning processes, and integration into customized tools like the Climate Impacts Group's Tribal Toolkit. And then finally, there's a number of technical or research outgrowths of the project that we can also point to, including a partnership with the U.S. Geological Survey to support the development of the Coastal Storm Modeling System, or COSMOS, in Puget Sound, a project to quantitatively assess the sea level rise vulnerability of the Puget Sound shoreline that is part of the Puget Sound Action Agenda, and a broader impacts project focused on communicating sea level rise uncertainty with new University of Washington collaborators. So overall, what we see is that this project really acted as a fulcrum for a whole variety of new efforts, innovations, and investments in coastal resilience in Washington State. That is what we were after.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Harriet. And with that, we're open for questions from all of you to explain anything better, more of what we did. Here's our contact information also, if you want to jot this down, of how you can get a hold of us, and we will address if you want to do offline conversations with us.
Thank you so much, Nicole, Ian, and Harriet. I learned a lot, especially just how many people it takes to really together something that is useful, usable, and used, which is something that Earth Lab is really finds important. So folks, please enter your questions in the chat. I've received a couple already. Thank you. I will start with my question though, because I'm the moderator. So I would love to hear examples or ideas about how this project might address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What were your thoughts about that going into this?
Thank you. That's a great question, and something that needs to be, I think, front and centered on all research projects whenever you're doing something going forward. I think I think there'd be a couple of different answers I would give to that. Some specific, more, some broader. So the broader would be the whole idea of this is making something accessible and available. And so it's not research for the sake of just research and you give your paper. Part of this is the A, website, B, workshops. I think we've had somewhere over 20 workshops on the topic throughout the region in one form or another, that brought just getting as much information to as many people so that they can use the information. And then once you give a workshop, then where you can get the you can go to the website to get the access to the information. Then the other is being able to use the information in ways that can affect communities, different communities. And for example, the Duwamish being a community where it's impacted by flooding. And how can you use this information? Very clearly, it'll address how you can find the impacts and then start to look for solutions. Another is tribal communities that use the projections in their adaptation planning, and the tribal climate tool that Ian mentioned also was created by SIG. It incorporates all of these sea level rise projections. So it's starting with a baseline of, we've got this information, this data that can be used for everybody and anybody, and then how do you make it as widely available as you can? I think that's the best approach.
Hope you're muted.
You're muted.
Thank you. I thought this was a really interesting question. Has there been any pushback on publishing this information from land developers or other groups?
Great question. We have not, that I've experienced. I would say what we have heard when we do public meetings is there's questions about what this information means, questions about the science, et cetera. What we do is we start with the conversation, often, most times, with at least that I do with meetings, is what are you experiencing now? What's flooding going on in your community? And then let's talk about what it looks like in the future by showing these projections. And somehow that conversation changes the tenor of the conversation for somebody. And so if it's so I haven't heard from a land developer saying, I don't believe this. I've heard people saying, yes, I am experiencing this now. And oh my goodness, now I see what we might be expecting in the future. Or even if not, they're still experiencing it now. And it's a way to segue into talking about future issues. Ian, Harriet, you want to talk about it?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit. So yeah, we haven't experienced any direct pushback from sort of real estate groups or insurance groups, which are oftentimes sort of identified as groups that might have sort of like a fiduciary interest or something like that. Interestingly enough, though, we have gotten a little pushback from some people associated with the idea that our projections may be too low and are really pushing for Washington State to plan for much higher magnitudes of sea level change, which was an interesting wrinkle that I did not expect when we kind of launched this project. It's also worth noting that our fundamental idea behind this project was filling an information gap. There is no regulatory requirement associated with these projections unless a community chooses to adopt something themselves. And so oftentimes the regulatory components associated with something like this are where, pushback occurs.
That's a really great segue, actually. We have two more questions that are related. So one person asked, if sea level rise projections continue to worsen, how often will these tools be updated? And then additionally, how will the new information about faster melting of Greenland, Arctic, Antarctica, Mount Rainier, et cetera, be incorporated into this 2018 data to keep websites relevant?
Harriet, do you want to?
You go for it and I'll add.
Okay. I think I will. Can you repeat the first question, Constance, just so I make sure I get it?
Yes. Yeah, it's how and how often will these tools be updated to changing conditions, I think.
Yeah, so I guess the question for that is, we are sort of continually assessing to the degree that we are able, and by we, I mean mostly sort of like the network of people that were involved in producing these projections. We kind of have these informal check-ins every now and again, really associated with the publication of new peer-reviewed literature associated with sea level rise that will oftentimes sort of prompt the conversation. Hey, is there anything in here that we think motivates us to really need to start to, work on an update of what we published 3 years ago now? So far, the answer has been no, but the science associated with sea level change is rapidly evolving. Projections will change. They will change both because we will learn more about the processes that drive sea level change, and be able to integrate those processes into models that tell us something more accurate about the future. They will also change because we are also experiencing sea level rise and tracking it. And part of what we expect in the future is based on what we are seeing now. And so the more time goes on, the more we learn about what's occurring now, and that informs what we expect in the future. So both of those things will drive updates. But in Washington State, we have no requirement for an update schedule, unlike other states, notably California, which does have an update schedule for climate planning information. We do not. And so, there is no formal date that I can point to for at which an update would be required.
Did you have anything to add, Harriet?
I was just going to add, sort of, re-emphasizing what Ian said, that this is kind of something that we are all constantly working on. So there's a lot of sort of side projects, like, for example, Ian and I are partnering with some other departments at UW in Earth and Space Sciences, looking specifically at the Antarctic ice sheet, which is a huge sort of contributor of potential global sea level rise in the future. And so while that's not directly tied right to this Washington Coastal Resilience Project, by us increasing our understanding and by partnering with other groups at UW to sort of, push the dial on the science, we can then sort of come back after that project or throughout that project and have that discussions of, like, so how does this global level science apply down here at Washington? And I think it's that constant iterative conversation of bringing global climate science down to the local level to make it relevant to decision makers. That's really important. And like Ian said, right, there's no mandate to continue have this on like a 5-year update schedule, but if advances in science are made that warrant that update and funding is available, I think that's where that conversation would inherently go.
So I come from policy and politics in a previous life, and would a mandate be helpful in your opinion as scientists, or would that actually not be helpful?
I guess I don't view it from my standpoint, from the standpoint of sort of doing an update process. It is kind of neither here nor there in terms of whether it would be helpful or not. It would set a schedule, which maybe would be helpful, because then it would sort of like, it would allow us to more directly answer that question, and, hopefully be associated with some support for doing so. Because right now, if we, when and if we do make that decision that an update is warranted, we'll have to go through the process of identifying funding and capacity to support that. And so, those states like California that do have an update process have also supported those from a funding standpoint, which makes them more tenable to accomplish.
Yeah. Well, while we're talking about like the state level of things, can you provide any details about how state agencies are using these projections right now? You gave like Tacoma and county examples, but what about the state level?
I'm happy to start off there, and Nicole, feel free to add in. So the Climate Impacts Group started doing a vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning process for Washington state parks back in 2017, I think. And they were curious how, not just focused on sea level rise, but how climate impacts in general would affect the agency's responsibilities to the state and to Washingtonians and the services they provide to residents of the state. The agency does manage and have a lot of parks on coastal areas, and the agency is already experiencing, reduced access from coastal flooding. When you have, a king tide event coinciding with a storm, they've had to close some campsites in low-lying coastal areas. They're experiencing some damage to facilities on low-lying coastal sites. So these are ongoing challenges that the agency is experiencing that are going to only be further exacerbated by sea level rise. And so what the agency actually did was we had a few workshops with them, and Ian was involved with them, where it was essentially a capacity building exercise that helped walk some agency staff through better understanding the 2018 sea level rise projections, looking at additional elements of sort of factors to consider in coastal design, like storm surge and wave run-up, reviewing park-specific sea level rise projections, identifying vulnerable areas, and thinking through some adaptation actions that can be then taken and implemented on the landscape to build resilience to facilities and parks that the agency is mandated to protect and provide access to Washingtonians for. So that's one agency-specific example, and I'll pass it to Nicole if she has something from another agency.
One of the whole pieces of this was looking at the states, looking at the state level, and how is this play into the state. And one really important aspect of it is the state is a funder of grants and loans and programs that support development. So if they are, whether it's WSDOT or RCO or WDFW, if they're issuing grants, are they asking their grantees to address sea level rise? And this is part of access. So one of the things that was done is an analysis of what state agencies are using grant information that incorporates sea level rise. If so, what's the language and how could that be applied to other state agencies? So that's a really important way of in some ways, kind of pushing the information out there and also getting people to use it. And then the second piece is going back to your question of the lovely question of mandate versus options or how does the state get involved? Is the state mandating use? And the state of Washington, we've approached it from a very different way from the state of California, but even so, very different from on the East Coast, where you have city by city, county by county, trying to figure this out and doing their own thing. Then you have the state of California that has come down and said, thou shalt, and this is what you have to do in terms of planning and policy, et cetera. And Washington State has really taken this more nuanced approach where ecology, for example, with the Shorelines program was an absolute partner at the table through all of the WCRP process, and is now coming up with examples of best examples of how to update shoreline master programs. Other state agencies are looking at what they need to do to be incorporating sea level rise. So we've provided that information. State agencies are all at different phases of incorporating that information and using it. For example, ferry terminals, how's WSDOT using that? And they're incorporating that into their design standards, et cetera. So there's a lot of state agency action going on as well as at the local levels.
Great, thank you. And somehow we are already almost at the bottom of the hour. We have just a couple minutes to go. And so I would like to just close out with giving you three an opportunity to share anything that you might think we might have missed, or what you would like to close out on, if there was anything you'd like to leave us with about this collaboration.
Well, I'd like to start with that. I'd like to start with that word of collaboration. And this was a really big tent with a lot of collaboration required, a lot of reiteration required, and the partners that we have made continue to be partners. Everything that Ian gave as examples are follow on from this, that it's one of those really unique aspects of science and policy and community engagement all coming together under one big tent to try to make this work and to move us forward, creating a baseline foundation that is really allowing us to go forward. And I think that's one of the brilliance of how this was set up. Ian, Harriet?
I'll just end by saying that, and this is sort of a tag on to the previous question about state agencies. We have a couple people on the call that are from state agencies, including some folks from ecology who are, I think the architects of this new proposed shoreline master planning competitive grant process that is designed specifically to facilitate community planning associated, at least in part associated with sea level rise. in Washington coastal communities. And I live in a small coastal community in Washington State, and I'm thankful that will be, that's something that will be available soon to coastal communities to facilitate this kind of planning. And I'm also, I'm honored to have been part of sort of making that happen, because I think that it is an important thing for coastal communities to start to, wrap their brains around collectively and try to figure out how to plan for. Another of a long list, right? This is just another planning challenge for coastal communities.
And I'll just close by saying, I think Ian's slide with the, the screen grab of Washington's coastline with all the stars on it, showing how it's for me very personally satisfying, because I think oftentimes we produce a lot of tools and we produce a lot of data. And sometimes what keeps me awake at night is, we can provide the best data in the world, but at the end of the day, if no one's using it, have we really pushed the dial? And by seeing that map, so relatively soon, right, just shy of 3 years after releasing that data, that this has been assimilated into many communities across the state, ranging from coastal tribes to state agencies, and also having, discussions. We were talking with an individual from NASA last week about some of the vertical land movement data that they're doing. So I feel like it's being assimilated at different jurisdictions, different levels of government, and that's really exciting that to be able to see sort of fingerprints of this happening across the landscape in Washington State.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you all three of you so much for being here today, for joining us. Folks, we will have one more Lunch and Learn in collaboration with the Washington Sea Grant in July, and that'll be with the Green Crab team. So stay on the lookout for that. And with that, we will see you all next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.